Chapter 3, Socialization. There has been and continues to be a debate over whether nature, heredity, or nurture, the social environment, most determines human behavior. We learn from feral children, from isolated children, from institutionalized children, deprived animals, and even twin studies. Although heredity plays a role, it is society that makes people human. People learn what it means to be and become members of the human community through language, through social interaction, and other forms of human contact. We learned in the last chapter about culture, and the way we pass our culture down from one generation to the next is through the socialization process, which is what this chapter is going to be all about. Feral children or wild children have been found. For example, in this picture there is the depiction of the wild child of France that was found in 1798. Now these children were living in the woods who may have been raised by wild animals. Typically they're unable to speak. They grunt or growl. They may walk on all fours. They're very animal-like. So this leaves us to question, what would humans be like if left untouched by society? Now, we never would take a child from its parents and lock them away in total isolation and say, hey, how did this child develop compared to other children who have lived normal lives with their families? But unfortunately, there have been cases where severe neglect and abuse have taken place. And in this case, we see case studies of isolated children. And isolated children show what humans might be like if secluded from society at an early age. And we have case studies of Anna, Isabel, and Jeannie. And Jeannie you will see a video of that I posted on e-learning. And the timing is when these young children have been found. With isolated children, language is the key to our culture and human development. It's how we share our way of living, sharing in the common language. Culture is what makes us human. It determines the specific behaviors, attitudes or values, the specifics of what we become, on top of our biological heritage. So we know both our biology and culture, our environment, have a key part in this. So that language is the key to our human development. Without there can be no culture or shared way of living. We all possess a biological heritage, but it is our culture that determines the specific behaviors, attitudes, or values, that specifics of what we become onto our biological heritage. So I mentioned the cases of Anna and Isabel and Jeannie. Anna and Isabel were cases where children were isolated in an attic away from family, deprived of a normal social environment. And at the age that they were found, they did not show signs of being able to learn language, and it really had an impact on not only their physical well-being, but their mental and emotional well-being. And Jeannie, we'll see her case study in another slide. Institutionalized children show that traits such as IQ, our cooperative behavior, and friendliness come from really early close relations or interactions or contact with other humans. Research on children that are raised in orphanages illustrate the importance of early interaction for human development. First, we have the H.M. Skeels and H.B. Dye experiment, the Skeels-Dye experiment, where two psychologists in the 1930s suspected the lack of a stimulating social environment in orphanages. They placed 13 infants with women at an institution, and those women took care of the infants, their physical needs. They played with them, they showed them attention. In the control environment, there were 12 infants that remained at the orphanage. They were the control group. After 2.5 years, Skeels-Dye tested all the children's intelligence, and those with close interactions with the women in the institution had higher IQs. They also followed up 21 years later. Those who had been raised in the institution with close human contact fared much better later on in life. They went further in school, they were self-supporting, as compared to those in the orphanage. We also have data of Romania orphanages, and there are orphanages in quite a few parts of the world. India, for example, and Romania. And these Romanian orphanages had very similar findings. The longer children lacked that stimulating interaction, the more difficulty they had intellectually. And again, it's also the timing that has on human development. So I previously mentioned Anna, Isabel, and Jeannie. Specifically, Jeannie. Jeannie was found at age 13. Anna and Isabel were found at much younger ages, 6 or 7. So it's critical the age at which these children raised in isolation were found. So even after intensive training, Jeannie's language never really developed. She currently resides in an institution. So from these examples, we learn that prior to age 13 is a really critical period to learn language, experience the human bonds and connections we have with others, so that normal intelligence, social bonds, and the ability to follow social norms can develop. Now, if you click on this link, you will find a short clip about Jeannie and the case of Jeannie. They've often referred to her as the wild child. If the link does not work, you want to check e-learning. There is a link under the video docs tab. Further evidence is found with deprived animals. We have psychologists Harry and Margaret Harlow. In 1962, they did the Harlow's rhesus monkeys experiments. And although we need to be careful in projecting, or extrapolating animal studies to human behavior, this experiment supports what we know about being raised in isolation. The monkeys were isolated, and they gave each 2 artificial mothers. And the picture on this slide illustrates the way those artificial mothers looked. One had a wire frame and wood head with a bottle to nurse. The other was made of cloth, or terry cloth, but no bottle to nurse. When the monkeys were frightened, they clung to the cloth mothers, indicating the need for that close physical contact. They could not adjust to monkey life well. The monkeys isolated for longer than 6 months had difficult adjustments. Those isolated 3 months could adjust to normal monkey life. There are also twin studies. The Minnesota Twin Studies has longitudinally tracked twins over a long period of time, seeing twins who are separated. One twin raised, if they were raised in similar environments, they had similar IQ tests, but if they were raised in very differing environments, They had different IQ scores. Again, indicating that not only your biology, which would be very close to almost identical in twins, but the environment also plays a part. So in sum, babies do not naturally develop into human adults. Although the body grows, human interaction is required for them to acquire the traits we consider normal for human beings. The process by which we learn the ways of our society through interaction with others is called socialization. Again, as I mentioned, is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. Socialization is the process by which we learn the ways of our society through our interactions with others. People are not born with an intrinsic or built-in knowledge of themselves or others. We develop skills, these reasoning skills, our morality, our personality, and a sense of self through social observation, contact, and interaction. And as we shall see next, we learn from these theoretical perspectives. So first we'll cover Charles Horton Cooley's Looking Glass Self. We'll cover George Herbert Mead's Role-Taking, Jean Piaget's Development of Reasoning, and then we'll look at some more global aspects of the self and reasoning. Lawrence Kohlberg, Carol Gilligan, for example. Charles Horton Cooley was a symbolic interactionist from the University of Michigan. He concluded that human development is socially created, that our sense of self develops from interaction with others. He coined the term the looking glass self to describe this process. The looking glass meaning that mirror which shows our reflection. So according to Cooley, this process takes 3 steps. First, we imagine how we appear to those around us. How do we look? As if looking at that image in the mirror. Second, we interpret or we imagine how others evaluate us. So we're interpreting their reactions to how we look in that reflection in our mirror. And last, we develop a feeling about ourselves. We develop a self-concept, and this self-concept can be either positive or negative. A favorable reflection in that social mirror leads to a very positive self-concept, while a negative reflection leads to a negative self-concept. Even if we misinterpret or misjudge others' reactions, they still become a part of our self-concept. And this is an ongoing, lifelong developmental process. We continue to change and adjust even well into old age. George Herbert Mead, also a symbolic interactionist, although he from the University of Chicago, he agreed with Cooley, but he emphasized the importance of play in the developing self. In play, we learn to take the role of others, to understand and anticipate how others feel and think. In other words, we put ourselves in someone else's shoes. According to Mead, children first are only able to take the role of their significant others. And these significant others are individuals who influence our lives, our parents, our siblings, our families. So these are the most important people in our lives. As the self develops, we internalize the expectations of other people and eventually the entire group. So Mead's term generalized other refers to the norms and the values and attitudes and expectations of people in general. Whether it be our family, our friends, coworkers, we're able to modify our behavior based on our anticipation of how they will react. Now, Mead also distinguishes the I from the me in the development of the self. I is the subjective, active, creative part of the social self. So, for example, I danced with him. The me is the objective part. These are attitudes internalized from our reactions with others. He danced with me. He says, we are not passive in this process. The I actively evaluates the reactions of others, how we react to others' expectations of us. Now, according to Mead, the development of the self goes through stages. And here we have an illustration of these 3 stages. Stage 1 is the imitation stage. At this stage, there is no sense of self. The children mimic gestures and words of others, and this usually is under the age of 3 years old. It's also known as the mimic stage. Stage 2, the play stage, begins at about age 3 and up till about age 6. And this is where children play the roles of specific people. This is when children start to play pretend princess or Spider-Man or doctor, policeman, fireman, chef. Stage 3 is the game stage or the team game stage in the first years of school, usually around age 6 or 7. And this is where we start to see organized play. We must learn the role of each member of the team and learn how to take on multiple roles. In other words, we anticipate what others will do. So we learn to take multiple roles. Now, Mead concludes that not only the self, but also the mind is a social product. We cannot think without symbols, and society gives us these symbols by giving us our language. The self, the mind, like language, are products of society. Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget studied children's ability to learn reason. He concluded that there were 4 stages in the development of cognitive skills. His theory is also known as the cognitive theory of development. In the first stage, the sensory motor stage, birth to about 2 years old, our understanding is limited. It's limited to direct contact with the environment. There's no cause and effect yet. We use our 5 senses: sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing to experience our environment. The second stage, the preoperational stage, ages 2 to 7 years, children develop ability to use symbols, especially language, allowing them to experience things without direct contact. There's not a real understanding of numbers, although many children can count. Not a real understanding of size or speed or causation. In the concrete operational stage, and this is about age 7 to 12 years old, children's reasoning abilities become much more developed. There's an understanding of numbers and causation and speed, but they have difficulty with abstract concepts like truth and honesty and justice. They're also able to take the role of the other. In the 4th stage, or the formal operational stage, age 12, approximately 12 and older, children start to become more capable of abstract thinking. We can use rules to solve problems. We can talk about concepts and draw conclusions. Moral development and reasoning is becoming established here. As adolescents, we start to question things. If X is true, why not Y? And some more global aspects of self and reasoning. The conclusions that Cooley, Mead, and Piaget come to regarding the self and reasoning appear to be universal. However, there is no consensus about the universality of Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development. Stages are not as distinct as Piaget concluded. The ages at which some people enter the stage differs from one person to another. Some people might get stuck in the concrete stage and never reach the level of abstract thinking. Differing social experiences or biology modify these stages. Research tells us that the self may develop earlier than Mead suggests. The content of what we learn varies from one culture to another, having very different experiences and the thinking processes that revolve around these experiences. We cannot assume that the development sequences will be the same for everyone. Next, learning personality, morality, and emotions. We're going to talk about Freud, Sigmund Freud, and the development of personality, Kohlberg's development of morality. And we're going to talk about some socialization into emotions, for what we feel, the society within us, the self and the emotions as social control. Our personality, our emotion, and internal controls are major parts of the makeup of who we are. So these are our more psychosocial or psychological theories. First, we have Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, a physician from Vienna, Austria, in the early 1900s, developed a theory of the origin of personality. He was the founder of psychoanalysis, which was a technique for treating emotional problems by exploring the subconscious mind. He believed that personality consists of 3 elements: the id, the ego, and superego. Now, the id is this pleasure-seeking. It consisted of inherited drives for self-gratification. It demands fulfillment of basic needs like attention, safety, food, and sex. The ego balances between the needs of the id and the demands of society, that pleasure-seeking side. The ego runs up against the constraints of society. The superego are the societal constraints. This is the social conscience we have internalized from social groups. It represents the norms and values of society. It gives us feelings of guilt or shame when we break the rules, and feelings of pride and self-satisfaction when we follow them. This is the culture within us. So if we look from the sociological perspective, I'd like to give an example of being a kid in a candy store. When you're a kid and you walk into a candy store and you look around and you want every piece of candy on the shelf. The chocolate, the Skittles, the gum, every piece of candy that's there. That's the id. That's the id. I want it. I want to do that now. I want that now. I want everything. The societal constraints, though, tell us not a good idea. It's not really right to do that. You shouldn't eat every piece of candy. What could happen? Well, too much candy can give you a stomach ache. You could get cavities in your teeth. You can gain weight. And you may not have the money to buy all of the candy in the candy store. So what does the ego do? Well, the ego balances the needs, balances the needs of the id and the demands of society. Well, maybe we can compromise. Maybe to satisfy that need for all the candy, we just have, maybe a Hershey Kiss, maybe one piece of gum instead of a whole pack. So we compromise between what we want and what societal constraints place on us. Now, before we talk about Kohlberg, I just want to say one more thing. Freud does emphasize socialization by acknowledging that our social groups transmit the norms and values that restrain the biological drives. But sociologists object to his view that inborn and unconscious motivations are a primary reason for human behavior. His view denies that basic tenet of sociology, that social factors shape people's behavior. Feminists are particularly critical of Freud because he assumed males to be normal and females to be inferior. So we move on to Kohlberg and the development of morality. Psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg concludes that humans go through a sequence of stages in the development of morality, and these stages are built upon Piaget's work. So first, we have the amoral stage. Children start here, and they seek immediate gratification with no concern for others. They're like the center of the universe, and the child does not distinguish at this stage right from wrong. Kohlberg's pre-conventional stage is from about 7 to 10 years old, and this is when the child follows the rules in order to stay out of trouble, viewing right from wrong and knowing what pleases parents, teachers, friends. We get rewards and we avoid punishment at this stage. The conventional stage, usually about 10 years old, is when the child starts to follow the norms and values of society. And the last stage, the post-conventional stage, is when the child reflects on abstract principles of right and wrong, using these principles to judge behavior, their own behavior and the behavior of others. Now, there have been criticisms of Kohlberg. Carol Gilligan, for one, who writes In a Different Voice, the title of her work, was a critic of Kohlberg, and she studied differences between how males and females view morality. She disagreed with Kohlberg's conclusions because they did not match her own experience, and he only used boys in his study. She argues morality begins at childbirth, and we are amoral. She found that females tend to evaluate morality in terms of personal relationships, in other words, how their actions affect others, and that males think in terms of the abstract principles of right and wrong. Other researchers have tested her conclusions and found no gender differences, that both males and females use personal relationships and abstract principles when making moral judgments. Researchers also checked to see if Kohlberg's theory applies in other cultures. They found that different cultures have their own ways to determine morality, and they teach members to use its norms in deciding what is moral. There's also evidence with research with babies. Researchers wanted to know if babies have morality, so they used experiments. They took puppets that did bad things and puppets that did good things, and babies usually liked the good puppets. Now, some believe we are born with morality, while others believe these experiments are flawed. You really have to look at the the evidence of those particular experiments. If babies do have an inborn morality, just like society applies a particular language onto our linguistic capacity, so does society apply its particular ideas about what is moral onto our moral capacity. This is the cultural relativity of morality. As languages differ in the world, so do moralities. And when we violate the morals that we've learned, we experience a sense of guilt or shame. Sociologists study how our identities are connected to morality and these emotions. Like the mind, our emotions also depend on socialization. Emotions are not simply the result of biology, they also depend on socialization within a particular society. If you look at global emotions, Paul Ekman, a psychologist and a researcher, studied emotions in several countries, and he concluded that everyone experiences 6 basic emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. He also found that people show the same facial expressions when they feel these emotions, leading for him to conclude that they are part of our biology. In expressing emotions, or sort of following the feeling rules, facial expressions, that universal way we express emotions, are only one way we show feeling. Body language, our voices and gestures are also what we use. And the rules we follow are based on our gender. Girls may hug and squeal when they see one another. Men may shake hands or fist bump to greet someone. In culture, especially in the U.S., if we look at the U.S., we may hug or shake hands. But in Japan, they may bow. People might bow when they greet one another. Arab men may kiss. Italians kiss on both cheeks. That's culture. Now, if we look at social class, upper class men and women may be more reserved in their expressions of emotion than those in the lower classes. And this usually cuts across gender. Relationships make a difference. We're more open with our close friends than with other people. And it also depends, too, on the setting. The emotions we express at, say, a rave would be very different than those we would express in a church or a synagogue. Also, the what we feel. Socialization not only guides us to different ways of expressing emotions, the how, the where, and the when, but also guides us in what we feel. A woman who gives birth in a culture that values boys over girls would feel sadness if she did not have a boy. We need more research to learn how culture guides people in how they express their feelings and in what they feel. What are the differences by age and gender, social class, and race ethnicity? Now, most socialization is meant to turn us into conforming members of society. The self and our emotions shape our behavior. We're not necessarily free because we are influenced by the expectations of our parents and friends, our neighbors and teachers, our class norms and college rules, our city, state, and federal laws. We do some things and we don't do others because of socialization. And when we think about acting a certain way, we know the emotion, good or bad, that would result. This is society keeping us in line. It sets up controls on our behavior. The society within us represents our awareness of the self in relationship to others. From our interaction with others, we learn how to think and reason and feel, and this shapes our behavior according to cultural standards. We also have the desire to avoid feeling ashamed or embarrassed. Our social mirror sets up effective inner controls over our behavior. So if I, for example, think, hey, on my wedding day, everyone complimented me on how I looked in my wedding dress. It made me feel really good. So I think I might wear that today. And I get up in the morning and I put my wedding dress on and I go to class to teach. Well, how would you think everyone would receive me if I walked into class with my wedding dress on? Probably everyone would laugh and think something was wrong with me. So when I think about it in terms of my social mirror, I kind of think about how I'm going to have a reaction from others and what emotion I might feel. I might feel sad or embarrassed. So that's what stops me from putting that wedding dress on before I go and leave and get ready for class. Next, our socialization into gender. We're going to discuss how gender messages teach us society's gender map. So we're going to learn the gender map, gender messages in the family, gender messages from peers, and gender messages in the mass media. First, learning the gender map. Because gender socialization is part of the way society turns us into certain types of people. By expecting different behaviors from people because they are male or female, sends boys and girls into different directions from an early age, which carries over into adulthood. Now, the process of learning our gender is socialization, that gender map. It provides us with the directions to act and think and even feel according to what our culture says is appropriate for our sex. We're going to get into a more in-depth discussion of this in Chapter 10. Gender is that set of learned expectations and how we should behave because we are identified as male or female. We get these gender messages in the family. First of all, parents begin the process, often consciously, by buying gender-specific toys and clothes. You know, the pink stuff for the girls and the blue stuff for the boys. But researchers have found that in our society, mothers often unconsciously reward their female children for being passive and dependent, and their male children for being active and independent. There was an experiment by Susan Goldberg and Michael Lewis that actually, experimented with a mother, and mothers would tend to hold their little girls closer to them and let their little boy children explore the environment around them. There was criticism to these experiments because they were in a controlled environment as opposed to a natural setting. When we think of toys and play, boys get action figures and girls get dolls. Now, some parents try to remain gender neutral with their children. They might buy, gender neutral toys like Legos or building blocks. But in play, parents do expect their sons to engage in more rough and tumble play, while girls show, they should remain, dainty. And it's usually evident in how we traditionally dress our children. You see in this little illustration on the slide, a little girl's in a dress and a little boy's in, a romper where, you can get down on the floor and play and a little bit easier. But it's, you want to keep that dress clean, so maybe little girls might be a little bit more reserved in their play. Gay and lesbian parents, research on gay and lesbian parents is very limited, but initial findings show that there is less gender stereotyping. In other words, children of lesbian couples and gay male couples, based on the reports of the parents, indicate that these parents show less stereotypical masculine feminine behaviors and were more tolerant of kids' behavior that did not conform. Our gender messages from our peers, if you look at our peer group, those who are roughly the same age, linked by a common interest and orientation, are our peers. And peers teach one another what it means to be male or female. Friends, classmates, neighborhood kids. Next to our parents, they have the very biggest role, the very powerful influence on us. In a study by Donna Etter, who studied 8th grade girls, she found that girls reinforce images of appearance and behavior that's viewed to be appropriate female behaviors. And boys, in a study of junior high boys studied by sociologist Melissa Milkey in 1994, boys used media images to develop their identities as males. and messages that sex and violence are for real males. So boys police one another's interest in ways of discussing sex and violence. The media also help teach gender. It reinforces society's expectations in many ways. Children are learning that male characters in TV and movies and cartoons are more important because they outnumber female characters 2 to 1, and they're typically in higher status positions. Females were once portrayed as timid and more dependent. Now they are more dominant and aggressive. The way body image, which is such a key part of gender, is portrayed in the media sends a strong message about what we should look like. These images are very difficult to live up to. We know, too, that a lot of these images we see in magazines and on advertisements and billboards are photoshopped, right? And so they're very, very difficult images to live up to. I also have a video clip here. If you click on the link, it will take you to Run Like a Girl campaign video. If the link does not work for you, go into the e-learning tab where the video docs or the web links are listed, and you will see the video there. Sort of illustrates again how we associate certain images with being girl-like versus, boys. With video games, sociologists are really beginning to study them and study video games. What is the influence on gender? There is a message of male dominance. 90% of the main characters are male. Males are also much more likely to play these video games than females. And so for many students who have answered the question on the Disney question and the journals prompt, if you did not look at a video, some students looked at video games and really supported that evidence. Advertising, on average, we're bombarded by roughly 200,000 commercials a year. Most of them are geared towards children. Boys are competing in outdoor settings, while girls are in very cooperative and indoor settings. Action figures are associated with boys, while dolls are associated with girls. As adults, these gender stereotypes continue. Males as dominant and rugged, females as sexy and submissive. These images become part of our own images. So in sum, the media continue the gender lessons that were started by our parents and reinforced by our friends. Gender is a primary basis for social inequality, giving privileges and obligations to one group while denying them to others. Sociologist Melissa Milke concluded that males use media images to discover who they are and what is expected of them as males. Yet we're not passive consumers of these media images. We select the ones that are significant to our situation and then use them to help us construct our understanding of the world. And here was the homework I was talking about. This is your journal prompt question. No need to do this again if you already did. The next thing we're going to go over are the agents of socialization. Family, the neighborhood, religion, daycare, the school, our peer groups, and the workplace. These are our agents of socialization. These are the people or groups that influence our self-concept, our attitudes, our behaviors, and other orientations towards life. And then when people move from one place, job, and or life situation to another, they often have to undergo what we call resocialization, the process of learning new norms and values, attitudes, and behavior. And we'll see that illustrated in a little bit. The first and the most influential agent of socialization, we call the primary agent of socialization, is the family. Within the family, we establish our motivations, our values, our beliefs, our sense of self, who we are and what we want out of life, what we think of ourselves. Parents, often unconsciously, send subtle messages to children about society's expectations for them as males and females. Social class differences influence how families socialize their children. Sociologist Melvin Cohn suggests that there are social class and occupational differences in child rearing, evidenced in parenting styles. For example, working class parents are concerned with outward conformity, keeping them in line, using physical punishment. And middle class parents focus more on the motivations for their children's behavior, developing their curiosity, self-expression, and self-control. The type of work is also a factor. Working class, blue-collar workers stress obedience and conformity. Also, they involve more supervised jobs, while middle-class work requires taking more initiative. If we look at social class and play, working class parents believe in providing food and shelter and comfort that are most important and let children play and develop naturally. While middle class parents, their children need guidance to develop properly. Play should accomplish something, become a team player versus just play for fun. The neighborhood has an impact on children's development. Some neighborhoods are better places for children to grow up than others. For example, residents of more affluent neighborhoods watch out for children more than do residents of poorer neighborhoods. They may not be there, or they may not be working while their children are home. Children from poor neighborhoods are more likely to get in trouble with the law, to become pregnant, or to drop out of school. Wealthier neighborhoods have less crime, strong ties with neighbors, more support groups, and they rely on one another. There are fewer families in transition. Most Americans belong to some form of religion. Religion plays a major role in the socialization of most Americans, even if they are not religious. Religion especially influences morality. Through religious participation, they learn doctrines and values, and as well as morality, and also learn about the hereafter. More than that, they also learn what kinds of dress and speech and manners are appropriate. There is a sense of identity and feeling of belonging. Participation in religion helps to integrate immigrants into the new society. It provides social mobility for the poor. It provides social contacts for jobs, and for African Americans, the means for social change. Daycare. While more mothers today are working for wages, daycare is now a significant agent of socialization. Children, in a national study, they found 1,200 children from infancy, followed them from infancy into kindergarten. Researchers found that the more hours per week that a child spends in daycare, the weaker the bonds between mother and child, and the greater the child's behavior problems. Children who spent less time in daycare were more affectionate to their mothers and more cooperative. This pattern held regardless of the quality of daycare, the family's social class, or whether the child was a boy or a girl. There's really no clear explanation. It could be that children who spend many hours in daycare do not have their emotional needs met, or that mothers who put their children in daycare for more hours are less sensitive to their children in the first place. The same researchers also found that the more hours children spend in daycare, the higher they score on language tests. And this was particularly true for children in low-income or even abusive homes. The school. Schools really serve both what we call manifest and latent functions. This is from the functionalist perspective. Manifest functions are intended or conscious functions. Schools teach knowledge and skills. They teach the basics, math, reading, writing, etc. We know that. That's a manifest function of schools and the education system. Latent functions are unintended or unconscious consequences. Children learn their role beyond the family in schools. They meet friends, classmates. So that is an unintended, unconscious function of schools in the education system. At school, children are outside the direct control of family and friends, and this exposes them to new values and new ways of looking at the world. Children learn universality, that the rules apply to all kids, no matter who their parents are. Schools have what we call a hidden curriculum, and these are values that are not explicitly taught but are inherent in school activities. For example, when stories or lessons are read, students may also be getting messages about patriotism and democracy. Also, students are learning lessons about scheduling and organization and following the rules. So, for example, if a child is reading a passage about the Declaration of Independence, it may be a reading assignment where they have to read the passage and answer some questions, but they're getting information also about the Declaration of Independence. And also, when you move from class to class in school and the bell rings and you have to move on to the next class or the next subject. So we get that organization that, things happen at a specific time and scheduling and so forth. In schools, they also have what is being referred to as a corridor curriculum. And this is where students are taught by one another outside of the classroom. Unfortunately, it's not always a positive lesson. It can often be, exclusionary. So a lot of bullying can take place in this arena. Who's cool versus not, based on, various characteristics, physical appearance and so forth. The in-group versus the out-group, which we'll talk more about in the next 2 chapters. Now, peer groups. Through education, going to school, peer groups gain influence, and the family influence on socialization sort of starts to decrease. We start to rely more on our friends than we do on our family for those influences. So next to the family, the peer group is the most powerful socializing force in society. The peer group is a powerful force, and you either conform or you are rejected. Music, clothing styles, dating standards, they may influence the future path you take. Are your friends college bound? The type of work or occupation versus being in with a bad crowd that gets involved with cheating and drugs and so forth. Sports are also very powerful socializing agents, and is where we meet a lot of our friends as well. Children are taught physical skills, but also values. Boys often learn that masculinity is related to success in sports. The more successful a boy is in a sport, the more masculine he's considered, and the more he's accepted. Now, is this the same for girls? Children also learn that teamwork, that work ethic, that discipline from being in sporting events. And is this the same for boys and girls? Is a question we need to address. The workplace is a major agent of socialization for adults. We learn a set of skills with those we work with. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they found that from the ages of 18 to 42, the typical person has held 11 jobs. It's 11 times we've had to learn a new role or as we enter a new occupation or workplace. Anticipatory socialization is when we learn to play that role before actually entering it. So this is, for example, when we take on internships or student teaching. We learn, we talk to those already in that field, and enables us to gradually identify with the role or occupation, sort of mentally rehearse for that career. The more we work in a particular occupation, the more it becomes a part of our self-concept. We say, I am a teacher, I am a sociologist, a doctor, etc. This is ongoing socialization. This job becomes a greater part of that self-concept. And each job we move to, if we do switch, we just learn those new rules of behavior in the different workplaces we enter. And that's resocialization, the process of learning new norms and values, attitudes, and behaviors. Resocialization occurs each time we learn something different from our previous experiences, like starting a new job. Most resocialization is only slight variations on things we've already learned already. But for some, it is a very intense experience, learning fundamentally different ways of looking at life, like a transition from high school to college, or joining a total institution, which we're going to refer to next. So, for example, Irving Goffman in 1961, he used this term total institution to refer to places like, joining, going into boot camp, entering a prison, a concentration camp, a seminary or a convent for the religious, going to a boarding school, for example. This is where people are cut off from the rest of society and become under almost total control of agents of the institution. The people who go through this or enter these total institutions go through a degradation ceremony, and this is often it involves when the person entering that institution is stripped of their formal identity. And this may include, fingerprinting, shaving the head, banning any personal items like jewelry, clothing, any hair accessories. So institutions are typically set, and provided with a uniform, even, so that everybody in that institution looks the same. They might even be assigned a number instead of being referred to by their name. So it's really degrading. It's really a way to degrade somebody and put them under total control of that institution. Their identity comes secondary to the institution. They're typically set apart from the public, and this keeps them from outside influences and information. So that institution will supervise activities. It suppresses previous roles, statuses, and norms, replacing them with new rules and values. Only thing that counts is their current status. Next, we're going to talk about, sociologists like to follow the life course, examine things throughout our life course. Socialization occurs throughout a person's entire lifetime and can be broken up into different stages. So the life course are the stages from birth through death. And as we pass through a stage, our behavior and orientations are affected. In other words, our lives are very different when we are children compared to when we are adults with adult responsibilities, for example. Our life course differs by social location, that is, our class, our race, ethnicity, and gender. It provides us with very different experiences. So first we'll talk about childhood, from birth to about age 12. A historian by the name of Philippe Aries, in 1965, he examined European paintings from AD 1000 to 1800. And he concluded that children were viewed as mini adults. And some of his work was criticized, but child, labor was a custom of the time. Boys worked as young as 7 years, and girls at 7 were taking on household tasks. Often, apprenticeships were taken at very, very young ages. And the reason why some of his work was criticized is really he examined these paintings for these depictions of children in his work. Seeing how, because back in that time you didn't have, videos or cameras or things to really, you had to depend on what was written or what was illustrated, diaries, journals, like letters to, that were passed from one to another. So back in history, to keep children in line, they often were beaten and subjected to psychological torture, treated really, really poorly. Industrialization really changed the way children were viewed. When children were freed from labor, that had, they had more leisure and they could go to school and they can postpone adult responsibility. Parents began to view children with tenderness and affection. They felt that children needed guidance, protection, and care and comfort. Today, we also view children in this light. Children need guidance, developing emotionally, intellectually, morally, and physically. Everyone's childhood has biological characteristics, being small and dependent, but the child's social experiences will vary from culture to culture. In adolescence, from about age 13 to 17, this stage is a social invention. It's not some natural age division. At some point early in our history, we moved from childhood to young adulthood. Our economic changes as a result of the Industrial Revolution brought about the material surpluses that allowed for adolescence to be invented. Teens were not needed for work. They remained outside the labor force, while at the same time, education increased in importance. So that gap between childhood and adulthood, termed adolescence, is marked by some cultures with initiation rites, or rites of passage we call them. And these initiation rites are a development of a self-identity and showing how one fits in society. So again, it's a development of our self-identity. So since this time allows adolescents to develop a self-identity, they set their own standard of clothing and language, music, hairstyles. So this is a stage that's not created by biology. This new stage that we refer to as adultolescence or transitional adulthood, and this takes place between ages 18 through 29. Again, significantly, 18 being, the age that we associated with becoming an adult. You take on changes by law that things you're allowed to do at age 18, voting and so forth. So in post-industrial societies, we are creating this new period of extended youth, transitional adulthood or adultolescence. So these adult responsibilities are postponed through extended education, like college, staying in school longer. So free from the control of parents. So even after college, many young people are returning home to live with their parents. It's very expensive to be living on our own. So living cheaply and establishing themselves in their career by living at home with parents. And so this has become a very post-industrial way of living. If we look at this table and this illustration, we go back to 1960, about 3/4 of women by age 30 had made that transition into adulthood, measured by leaving home, finishing school, getting married, having a child, or being financially independent. About 65% of men did so. And if you do look at the age 20, more so in the 1960s, we saw women and men. There was a higher percentage of them transitioning to adulthood at that younger age. As we move into the year 2000 and 2010, the data show that numbers reduced, that percentage is reduced. 46% of women, 31% of men reached that stage by their 30s. And if we look in the 2010, 42% of women and 28% of men. So the numbers are really going down in that transition into adulthood. This is data and a study done by Frank Furstenberg. And this data really show that stage, that adultolescence, that transitional adulthood, where people need to really are starting to try to establish themselves before they enter that new stage in the life course. Next, we're going to look at the middle years, and this ranges from age 30 to 65. And we've broken these into two categories: the early middle years and the later middle years. So the early middle years, this can be separated into two periods. The early middle years range from about age 30 to about 49. And people at this point are really sure of themselves and their goals. But events can happen, and things like divorce or losing a job, these things can happen, and they can have consequences that affect us. Women in particular will face challenges during this period, giving the message that women can have it all, work, being a wife, being a mom, but it creates a lot of competing demands. You can't possibly give 100% to each of those roles. So it really is, can be a struggle for many women, juggling work and family. The later middle years, this is from about age 50 to 65 or so, our mortality and our health issues, start to hit us at this time. We begin to reorient our thinking, evaluate the past, and coming to terms with what lies ahead. In other words, we shift our thinking from our time since birth to the time we have left to live. And many face what is known as a midlife crisis. And this can happen for both men and women. Thinking about what have we accomplished? What goals have we not yet met? So many are, struggling with the midlife crisis, but also there are many people that are in what we call the sandwich generation, struggling with raising children, young children, and then also caring for parents or elders in the family. And that's a really unique, again, a characteristic of post-industrial society, where we have, people postponing marriage and childbearing till later years, so they have young children, and also people, parents and grandparents living longer, and so they're still living, and so a lot of, later middle-aged, mostly women, it mostly affects women, but some men too, are in this sandwich generation, struggling to, in the middle of raising a young family, but also caring for elder parents as well. For others, still this stage is the most comfortable period of life. These are for people who have established their career, they're in stable marriages, they might own their home, so they have a higher standard of living, maybe new cars, vacationing, and their children are grown and independent. Now, in the older years are about from age 65 on, and again, this too can be separated into two periods. The transitional older years, where improvements, we have improvements in nutrition and public health and medical care, and have delayed really that onset of old age. We have a longer life expectancy. So the period between, retirement, usually around age 65 through 75, is emerging. People are in better health. They're staying connected just through social networking and computers and FaceTiming, and so they're more aware, though, that death is approaching. So for many, this is simply an extension of those middle years, but really, really identifying with the fact of the mortality. So those who still work, some people are still working, are socially active, don't consider themselves old. Then we get to the later older years, and this is approximately 75 and older. And so for some, this period might even begin at a later stage, maybe 80 or 85. So for most, there is a growing frailty and illness at this stage. So for all who reach this stage, mortality is becoming very evident. Death is at the end of this stage. So for some, the physical decline can be slow. More and more are reaching the age of 100 and remaining alert and in very good physical health. And then you have the other extreme of the later year adults, where they're, again, frail, and maybe dementia or Alzheimer's is setting in. So applying the sociological perspective to the life course, the social significance of the life course is how it is shaped by social factors. The period in which the person is born and lives his or her life is as well as the social location, our social class, our gender, our race and ethnicity. Those living in poverty may feel older sooner, having lived maybe a harsher life than someone from a wealthier class who may have lived more comfortable. And also, men and women may face different things. So our life course is not just based on biological changes that occur. Social forces too affect the direction our life takes. So we ask ourselves, are we prisoners of socialization? Sociologists do not think of people as little robots who are simply the result of their exposure to these socializing agents. Although socialization is powerful, we all have a self and we use our minds to reason and make choices. And because of this, each of us is actively involved in the social construction of the self. Our experiences have an impact on us, but we are not destined or doomed to keep those orientations if we do not like them. We can choose to change our experiences by exposing ourselves to other groups and ideas, even within the limitations some of us may face.